Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today we're diving into something really exciting, a crossover story that I've been working on. What would happen if Ichigo Kurosaki from Bleach somehow ended up in the high school DxD universe? I know sounds crazy, right? But hear me out. We're talking about a post-thousand-year blood war Ichigo who gets dimensionally displaced and has to navigate a completely different supernatural world with devils, angels, and fallen angels instead of soul society. His powers are suppressed, he doesn't know the rules, and he's trying to figure out how to get home while protecting innocent people. This is part one of what's going to be a longer series, so if you're into crossover stories or just want to see how these two universes might clash, stick around. Let's jump right into it. The evening sky over Karakura town was painted in shades of amber and crimson, a deceptively peaceful canvas that belied the spiritual turbulence brewing beneath its surface. Ichigo Kurosaki stood atop a familiar rooftop, his orange hair catching the dying light as he surveyed the town he'd protected for years. At 17, he carried himself with a confidence that spoke of battles fought and won, yet his brown eyes held a weariness that belonged to someone far older. "You're brooding again," came a familiar voice from behind him. Ichigo didn't turn around as Rukia Kuchiki materialized from the shadows, her petite form materializing in a shimmer of spiritual particles. Even after all this time, her sudden appearances still managed to catch him off guard, though he'd learned not to show it. "I'm not brooding, I'm thinking," he replied, finally glancing over his shoulder at the raven-haired Soul Reaper. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Rukia stepped beside him, her violet eyes scanning the horizon with the same practiced intensity. "Because from where I stand, you look exactly like you did before we fought Yawatch." That same weight of the world on my shoulders expression. The mention of the Quincy King's name brought a slight tension to Ichigo's jaw. It had been 6 months since the final battle against the Von Reich, 6 months since he'd nearly lost everything and everyone he cared about. The physical wounds had healed, but the psychological scars ran deeper than he'd ever admit out loud. "Maybe because I learned that no matter how strong I get, there's always going to be something else out there," Ichigo said quietly. "Something that could threaten everyone I care about." Before Rukia could respond, a thunderous crack split the air above them. Both Soul Reapers instinctively reached for their Zanpakuto as a jagged tear appeared in the sky, roughly the size of a city bus and growing larger by the second. The edges of the rift writhed with an energy that was familiar yet wrong. It resembled the spiritual pressure of a holo, but twisted into something far more sinister. "That's not a garganta," Rukia said, her voice tight with concern as she drew her sword. "The Reiatsu signature is completely different." Ichigo's hand found the hilt of Zangetsu, the familiar weight of his massive blade both comforting and alarming. Even in its sealed state, he could feel the sword's eagerness for battle, as if it sensed something dangerous about this new threat. "Whatever it is, we need to." His words were cut off as something emerged from the rift. At first glance, it resembled a holo, the characteristic bone-white mask, the spiritual pressure of a predator, the inhuman proportions. But as the creature fully materialized, Ichigo realized this was something entirely different. Its mask bore markings that seemed to shift and writhe like living tattoos, and its body was wreathed in darkness that absorbed light rather than simply blocking it. "Renji should be here soon," Rukia said, already moving into a combat stance. "I sent him a hell butterfly when the rift first appeared." As if summoned by her words, Renji Abarai's spiritual pressure flared nearby before he landed on the rooftop in a crouch, his wild red hair whipping in the supernatural wind generated by the growing rift. "What the hell is that thing?" he demanded, staring up at the creature that was now descending toward the city below. "Nothing good," Ichigo replied grimly, drawing Zangetsu in a fluid motion. The oversized cleaver materialized with its familiar weight, but something felt off. The spiritual connection between him and his Zanpakuto, usually as natural as breathing, seemed strained somehow. The creature let out a sound that was part holo's shriek, and part something far more disturbing, like reality itself was being torn. Windows throughout the neighborhood began to crack from the sonic assault, and Ichigo felt his spiritual pressure spike in response. "We need to stop it before it reaches the residential area," he said, launching himself from the rooftop with a burst of spiritual energy. The creature's head snapped toward him with predatory interest, and Ichigo found himself staring into eyes that weren't just empty sockets like a normal holo's, but seemed to contain swirling galaxies of darkness. For a moment, he felt a vertigo that had nothing to do with his aerial position, as if he was looking not at a creature, but through a window into somewhere else entirely. "Gaitsu ga Tainsho," he shouted, channeling his spiritual pressure into his blade. The familiar blue-white energy crescent erupted from Zangetsu, streaking toward the creature with deadly precision. But instead of striking its target, the energy blast seemed to be absorbed by the darkness surrounding the being, disappearing without a trace. "That's new," Ichigo muttered, adjusting his trajectory to avoid the creature's retaliatory strike, a blast of that same light-absorbing darkness. Rukiya and Renji flanked the creature from opposite sides, their own attacks coordinated with the precision born of years fighting together. Rukiya's ice-based techniques created a momentary shell around the creature, while Renji's Zabi-Maru extended in its whip-like form to strike from an unexpected angle. The creature broke free of the ice with contemptuous ease, but Renji's attack seemed to have more effect. Where Zabi-Maru's segments struck, the creature's form flickered like a bad television signal. "It's not fully materialized in our dimension," Rukiya called out, her analytical mind already working on the problem. "That's why direct spiritual attacks aren't working properly." "Then how do we fight it?" Renji demanded, narrowly avoiding another blast of dark energy. Ichigo's mind raced as he observed the creature's movements. There was something familiar about the way it moved through space, almost as if it was sliding between dimensions rather than flying through the air. It reminded him of something, but he couldn't quite place what. The creature suddenly changed tactics, ignoring the three Soul Reapers to dive toward the city below. Ichigo's blood ran cold as he realized its target, a group of high school students walking home late from cram school, completely unaware of the supernatural battle raging overhead. "No," Ichigo poured on the speed, using every technique he'd learned to reach the students before the creature did. Shunpo carried him through the air in a series of high-speed movements that would have been invisible to human eyes. He reached the group just as the creature's claws extended toward them, interposing his body between the attack and the innocent civilians. The dark energy struck him directly in the chest, and pain unlike anything he'd experienced since his fight with Yawatch tore through his body. But it wasn't just pain, it was displacement. He could feel reality bending around him, his spiritual pressure fluctuating wildly as the creature's attack did something to his very existence. The students below him flickered in and out of focus, and he realized with growing horror that he was the one becoming less real. "Ichigo," Rukiya's voice seemed to come from very far away, even though he could see her diving toward him. The creature let out another reality-tearing shriek, and suddenly, the rift above them began to expand exponentially. What had been a localized phenomenon was now threatening to engulf the entire neighborhood. "It's using me as an anchor," Ichigo realized with dawning horror. "My spiritual pressure, it's using it to stabilize the rift." He tried to pull back to break whatever connection the creature had established, but found that his movements were sluggish, as if he was moving through thick liquid. The creature's eyes, those swirling galaxies of darkness, seemed to pull at him with an irresistible force. "Bankai," he shouted desperately, hoping that his increased power would be enough to break free. But as his spiritual pressure spiked to activate his Bankai, the creature's absorption of his energy intensified. Instead of his familiar black-clad form, Ichigo felt his power being drawn away, pulled into the expanding rift above them. "The rift is destabilizing," Renji called out, his voice filled with alarm. "The whole area is going to collapse into whatever's on the other side." Ichigo made a decision that would haunt him for months to come. Instead of continuing to fight the pull, he embraced it, allowing his spiritual pressure to flow freely into the creature and the rift beyond. If he could overload whatever was causing this phenomenon, maybe he could collapse the rift before it consumed Karakura town. "Tell everyone," he began, looking down at Rukiya and Renji. But the words were lost as reality folded in on itself. The last thing Ichigo saw was Rukiya's face, twisted in anguish as she reached for him, before everything dissolved into swirling darkness. Consciousness returned slowly, accompanied by a splitting headache and the distinct feeling that something fundamental had changed. Ichigo groaned, pushing himself up from what felt like grass beneath his palms. The surface was real enough, but everything else felt off. His spiritual pressure, which had been as natural as breathing for years, was muted to barely a whisper of its former strength. It was still there, but dampened as if something was actively suppressing it. More concerning was the complete absence of any familiar spiritual signatures. No Rukiya, no Renji, no trace of soul society's influence anywhere within his sensing range. Opening his eyes, Ichigo found himself in what appeared to be a park in the middle of a city. The architecture was definitely Japanese, but subtly different from Karakura town. The buildings seemed newer, more modern, and there was an energy in the air that reminded him of spiritual pressure, but wasn't quite the same. "Great," he muttered, getting to his feet and checking for injuries. Physically, he seemed fine, though his shihakusho had been replaced by what appeared to be a standard Japanese high school uniform: black slacks, white shirt, dark jacket. Even more concerning, Zangetsu was nowhere to be seen, though he could still feel the blade's presence somewhere deep in his soul. A quick survey of his surroundings revealed a city that was unmistakably Japanese but unfamiliar. Street signs indicated he was in something called Kuo Town, a name he'd never heard before despite his extensive knowledge of Japan's geography. "This has to be some kind of illusion," he said to himself, though the words felt hollow. The creature's attack had felt like dimensional displacement, not a mental technique. If that was true, then he might not even be in the same universe anymore. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of voices nearby. Following the noise, Ichigo discovered what appeared to be a group of high school students engaged in some kind of altercation. 3 boys were surrounding a single student, their postures aggressive and threatening. "Come on, Issei," one of them was saying. "You know you saw Rias Gremari's panties yesterday. What color were they?" The surrounded boy Issei, apparently, was shaking his head frantically. "I told you guys I didn't see anything. And even if I did, I wouldn't tell you." Despite everything he'd been through in the last few minutes, Ichigo found himself almost smiling. Some things were apparently universal. Teenage boys being idiots was apparently one of them. But his amusement faded as the situation escalated, with one of the bullies grabbing Issei's shirt. "You're lying," the bully snarled. "Everyone knows you're the biggest pervert in school. There's no way you didn't look." Ichigo was moving before he'd consciously decided to intervene. Years of protecting others had made the response automatic, and his reduced spiritual pressure apparently hadn't affected his physical capabilities. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from genuine confidence. "Leave him alone." The 3 bullies turned to look at him, taking in his unfamiliar face and school uniform. The leader, a pudgy boy with mean eyes, sneered at the interruption. "This doesn't concern you, transfer student. Walk away." "Can't do that," Ichigo replied calmly, stepping closer. There was something about his presence, even with his spiritual pressure suppressed, that made people nervous. Years of facing down gods and monsters had given him an aura that transcended mere physical intimidation. The bully's sneer faltered slightly, but he pressed on. 3 against 1, genius. You sure you want to do this?" Ichigo's response was to crack his knuckles, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "I've faced worse odds." What followed was less a fight than a demonstration. Ichigo's combat experience, gained through countless battles against superhuman opponents, made dealing with ordinary bullies almost trivial. Within 30 seconds, all 3 boys were on the ground, nursing various bruises and looking at him with a mixture of fear and awe. "Find something better to do with your time," Ichigo advised them as they scrambled to their feet and fled. Thank you," Issei stammered, staring at Ichigo with undisguised admiration. "That was amazing. Are you some kind of martial arts expert?" "Something like that," Ichigo replied evasively. Up close, he could sense something unusual about this Issei character. There was a spiritual energy surrounding him, but it was different from anything Ichigo had encountered before. Not the clean power of a soul reaper, or the twisted energy of a holo, or even the structured power of a Quincy. This was something entirely new. "I'm Issei Hyodo," the boy continued, apparently oblivious to Ichigo's internal analysis. "Are you really a transfer student? I don't think I've seen you around Kuo Academy before." Kuo Academy. The name triggered something in Ichigo's memory, not a specific recollection, but an intuition that this place was important somehow. His reduced spiritual senses were picking up traces of that same unusual energy throughout the area, as if the entire school was somehow touched by supernatural forces. "Ichigo Kurosaki," he replied. "And yeah, I guess you could say I'm new around here." That was certainly true enough. The question was whether he'd be able to find a way back to his own world, or if he'd be stuck in whatever dimension he'd landed in. Either way, his immediate priority had to be establishing some kind of cover identity, and figuring out exactly what kind of supernatural forces were at work in this place. "Hey Ichigo," Issei said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Can I ask you something? Do you notice anything weird about this school? Like really weird?" Ichigo's attention sharpened. If Issei was picking up on the supernatural elements despite apparently being human, then either he was more sensitive than he appeared, or the supernatural community here was less subtle than the one he was used to. Define weird, he replied carefully. Well, there's the occult research club, Issei began, glancing around nervously as if afraid of being overheard. They meet in the old school building, and weird stuff always happens around them. Plus, some of the students here are, I don't know how to explain it, different, like they're not quite human. Before Ichigo could respond, a new spiritual pressure suddenly flared nearby, strong, controlled, and definitely not human. His head snapped toward the source, his hand instinctively reaching for where Zangetsu should have been. We should go, he said urgently, grabbing Issei's arm. Now, what? Why? Issei looked confused by the sudden change in Ichigo's demeanor. Because whatever's coming isn't interested in having a friendly chat, Ichigo replied grimly. The source of the spiritual pressure revealed itself moments later as a figure descended from the sky, landing gracefully in the park where they stood. It was a woman with long black hair and violet eyes, dressed in what appeared to be a form-fitting black outfit that left little to the imagination. But it was the wings sprouting from her back, black feathered wings that radiated power, that confirmed Ichigo's suspicions. This definitely wasn't his world. Well, the woman said, her voice carrying a musical quality that didn't quite hide the underlying menace. What do we have here? A little birdie told me there was something interesting in this area. Her eyes fixed on Ichigo with predatory interest, and he felt her spiritual pressure probing at his defenses. Whatever she was definitely not human, and she was definitely sizing him up as a potential threat. Rainier, Issei whispered, his voice filled with recognition and fear. But you thought I was just a normal girl. The woman Rainier laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, sweet little Issei, there's so much you don't understand about this world. Fallen angel, Ichigo said quietly, the pieces finally clicking into place. The wings, the spiritual pressure, the predatory demeanor, it all fit patterns he'd learned during his time in Soul Society, even if the exact details were different. Rainier's attention snapped to him with renewed interest. Oh, you know what I am? How very interesting. And here I thought you were just another human with a bit more spiritual awareness than usual. She gestured, and a spear of light materialized in her hand, the same type of energy weapon Ichigo had seen Quincy use, but with a subtly different resonance. But you're something more, aren't you? I can sense it, even if I can't quite identify what you are. Issei, Ichigo said without taking his eyes off the fallen angel. When I say run, you run. Don't look back, don't try to help, just get as far away from here as possible. But, no buts, this isn't a fight you can help with, Rainier laughed again. How noble, protecting the weak human while facing certain death. It's almost admirable in its futility. She raised the light spear, preparing to throw it, and Ichigo felt his spiritual pressure surge in response. Even suppressed, his power was apparently enough to trigger his basic abilities. The familiar weight of Zangetsu began to materialize in his hand, not the full manifestation he was used to, but enough. Run, he shouted to Issei. The boy hesitated for a split second, then turned and fled as fast as his legs could carry him. Rainier started to pursue, but found her path blocked by Ichigo, who now held a translucent version of his massive cleaver. Your fight's with me, he said simply. Indeed it is, she replied, her expression shifting from amusement to genuine interest. Let's see what you can do, mystery boy. The spear of light flew toward him with incredible speed, but Ichigo's reflexes, honed by years of combat against superhuman opponents, were up to the challenge. He deflected the projectile with Zangetsu's blade, the clash of energies sending sparks flying in all directions. Interesting, Rainier mused, already forming another spear. You're not using sacred gear power, and you're definitely not an angel or devil. What are you? Just someone who doesn't like bullies, Ichigo replied, launching himself forward with a burst of speed. The battle that followed was intense but brief. Ichigo's reduced power levels meant he couldn't simply overpower his opponent the way he might have in his own world, but his experience and technique more than made up for the difference. Rainier was strong and fast, but she fought like someone who was used to having a significant power advantage over her opponents. Ichigo, on the other hand, had learned to fight gods. The decisive moment came when Rainier attempted to use her speed advantage to get behind him for a killing blow. Instead, she found herself staring down the edge of Zangetsu's blade, the massive sword somehow having moved faster than her supernatural reflexes could follow. This is over, Ichigo said quietly. For a moment, they stood frozen in tableau, the fallen angel with her light spear raised, Ichigo with his blade at her throat. Then Rainier smiled, an expression that was equal parts impressed and frustrated. "You're right," she said, dismissing her weapon and stepping back. "It is over, for now." She spread her wings, preparing to take flight. "But this isn't finished, mystery boy. The supernatural world has taken notice of you now, and that's not something you can undo." "Looking forward to it," Ichigo replied dryly. Rainier's laughter followed her as she disappeared into the night sky, leaving Ichigo alone in the park with far more questions than answers. He was definitely not in his own world anymore, that much was certain. The spiritual energies here were different, the supernatural creatures operated by different rules, and his own power was somehow diminished. But some things remained constant. There were innocent people who needed protection, and there were predators who would exploit the weak given the chance. Whatever else had changed, his purpose remained the same. Ichigo dismissed Zangetsu and began walking toward what he hoped was the main part of town. He needed to find food, shelter, and most importantly, information about this new world he'd found himself in. The mention of devils and angels suggested a cosmology very different from the one he was used to. And if he was going to survive here, he'd need to understand the new rules quickly. Behind him, the park where he'd fought Rainier showed no signs of the supernatural battle that had taken place there. Whatever else was true about this world, it seemed that the masquerade between the supernatural and mundane was still in effect. As he walked through the quiet streets of Kuo town, Ichigo reflected on how much his life had changed in the span of a single evening. This morning, he'd been a high school student in Karakura town, worried about ordinary things like exams and part-time jobs. Now he was apparently stranded in an alternate dimension, facing down fallen angels and trying to figure out where he fit in a completely alien supernatural hierarchy. "Just another day in the life of Ichigo Kurosaki," he muttered to himself, then paused as he realized something. For the first time in months, he wasn't bored. Maybe this new world wouldn't be so bad after all. The thought was interrupted by a familiar spiritual pressure, the same unusual energy he'd sensed from Issei earlier, but much stronger. Turning toward the source, Ichigo saw lights in the windows of what appeared to be an old school building in the distance. The occult research club that Issei had mentioned, he realized. Whatever was happening there, it was big enough to register on his spiritual senses even from this distance. Against his better judgment, he found himself walking toward the building. He'd always been too curious for his own good. As Ichigo approached the old school building, he could sense multiple spiritual presences inside, at least 4 distinct signatures, each one stronger than any ordinary human, but still not quite matching the power levels he was used to from his own world. There was something almost familiar about the energy patterns, as if they were related to powers he knew but expressed differently. The main entrance was locked, but that had never been much of an obstacle for someone with his abilities. A small application of spiritual pressure was enough to manipulate the locking mechanism, and soon he was standing in a darkened hallway that smelled of old wood and chalk. Following the spiritual signatures, Ichigo made his way to what appeared to be a club room on the 2nd floor. Light spilled from under the door, and he could hear voices within both male and female, engaged in what sounded like serious discussion. "Can't be a coincidence," a female voice was saying. "First the unusual spiritual readings this afternoon, and now a fallen angel operating openly in our territory." "Rias is right," came another voice, this one male. "Something's changed in the supernatural balance around here. The question is what?" Ichigo hesitated outside the door. These people clearly knew about the supernatural world, and from the sound of it, they were actively involved in whatever passed for supernatural politics in this dimension. Getting involved with them could provide valuable information, but it would also mean revealing his own nature to potential enemies. The decision was made for him when the door suddenly swung open, revealing a young woman with long crimson hair and blue-green eyes. She was strikingly beautiful in a way that seemed almost otherworldly, and the spiritual pressure radiating from her was definitely not human. "I thought I sensed someone out there," she said calmly, her eyes fixed on Ichigo with obvious interest. "Please come in, we have things to discuss." Left with little choice, Ichigo stepped into the room and found himself facing what appeared to be a group of high school students. But the spiritual pressures they were giving off told a very different story. Whatever these people were, they were definitely not ordinary teenagers. "My name is Rias Gremory," the red-haired woman continued, settling gracefully into what appeared to be the president's chair behind a large desk. And you, I believe, are the mystery that's been causing such interesting disturbances in our quiet little town." Ichigo met her gaze steadily, his years of dealing with supernatural politics coming into play. "Ichigo Kurosaki, and I'm guessing you're not exactly what you appear to be either." Rias smiled, an expression that was both welcoming and predatory. "How very perceptive." "No, we're not. The question is, what exactly are you, Ichigo Kurosaki? Because whatever it is, it's something I've never encountered before." As he looked around the room at faces that ranged from curious to wary to openly hostile, Ichigo realized that his new life was about to become very complicated indeed. "But then again, when had it ever been simple? That," he said finally, "is a very long story." "Fortunately," Rias replied, her smile widening, "we have all night." The Occult Research Club room was larger than it had appeared from the hallway, furnished with an eclectic mix of antique furniture and modern amenities. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with texts that Ichigo suspected weren't your typical high school reading material. The air itself seemed charged with supernatural energy, making his reduced spiritual pressure tingle with recognition. Ria's Gremory sat behind her desk like a queen holding court, her crimson hair catching the lamplight as she studied Ichigo with undisguised fascination. Around her, 4 other figures arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, each one radiating the same non-human energy signature that marked their president. "Please have a seat," Ria said, gesturing to an ornate chair that had been positioned directly across from her desk. "I find these conversations go much better when everyone is comfortable." Ichigo remained standing, his instincts keeping him ready for sudden movement. Years of supernatural politics had taught him that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who invited you to sit down first. "I'll stand, thanks," he replied evenly. "So, Devil?" The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Several of the assembled students tensed visibly. A blonde boy with an almost feminine beauty reached toward what Ichigo assumed was a concealed weapon, while a small girl with short white hair shifted into a subtle combat stance. Rias, however, simply laughed, a sound like silver bells that didn't quite hide the underlying steel. "My, you don't waste time with pleasantries, do you? Yes, we're devils. Pure-blooded devils, in fact, which is becoming increasingly rare these days." She stood gracefully, her movements carrying an otherworldly elegance that reminded Ichigo uncomfortably of some of the more dangerous Arrancar he'd faced. "The question that interests me is how you knew. Your spiritual pressure is unusual, powerful but suppressed somehow, and definitely not anything I recognize from the usual supernatural classifications." "I've had experience with non-human entities before," Ichigo said carefully, not wanting to reveal too much about Soul Society or his own nature. "You learn to recognize the signs. Fascinating." A new voice entered the conversation, male, older, with an undertone of barely controlled violence. The speaker was a tall young man with silver hair and golden eyes, his spiritual pressure more aggressive than the others. "And exactly what kind of experience would that be?" "Down volley," Ria said mildly, though Ichigo noticed her eyes never left his face. "We're having a civilized conversation." "Are we?" The silver-haired young man Volley stepped forward, his spiritual energy spiking noticeably. "Because from where I stand, we have an unknown factor who somehow detected Rainer's presence, engaged her in combat, and walked away unharmed. That doesn't sound like ordinary experience with non-human entities." Ichigo's attention sharpened. "You know about my fight with the fallen angel. We know about everything that happens in our territory," another voice chimed in. This one belonged to a beautiful young woman with long black hair and violet eyes, her spiritual pressure carrying an electric quality that made the air itself seem to hum. "I'm Akeno Heimjima, by the way, Ria's queen." The terminology was unfamiliar, but the hierarchical implications were clear enough. Whatever social structure these devils operated under, it was apparently based on some kind of chess-like ranking system. "Akeno monitors all supernatural activity in Kuo Town," Rias explained. "Imagine our surprise when we detected a significant battle taking place in our territory, involving combatants we'd never encountered before." "Your territory?" Ichigo's voice carried a dangerous edge that made several of the devils take an involuntary step back. "I wasn't aware that any group had claimed ownership of an entire town." "Not ownership," the blonde boy said quickly, his voice carrying a refined accent. "Stewardship. We protect the human population from supernatural threats that would otherwise overwhelm them." He inclined his head politely. "Yudo Kiba, knight of the Gremory family." The small white-haired girl spoke for the first time, her voice flat and emotionless. "Koneko Taoju, Rook." She paused, tilting her head as she studied Ichigo with golden eyes. You smell wrong, Koneko, Rias said with gentle reproach. No, it's fine, Ichigo replied, actually finding the girl's bluntness refreshing after the verbal dancing he'd been doing with the others. Wrong how? Like you're from somewhere else, Koneko said simply. Somewhere that doesn't exist. The statement hit closer to the truth than Ichigo was comfortable with, but before he could respond, Vali stepped forward again, his spiritual pressure flaring with obvious challenge. Enough talk, the silver-haired devil said. If you want to know what he is, let me test him properly. Vali, Rias began, but her protest was cut off as white light suddenly erupted around the aggressive devil's form. What emerged from the light was something that made even Ichigo's experienced mind struggle to process. Vali was now encased in white draconic armor that radiated power like a miniature sun, complete with glowing wing-like appendages that definitely weren't decorative. Sacred gear, Kiba explained quietly, apparently noticing Ichigo's confusion. Vali possesses one of the 13 Longinus divine dividing. And now I'm going to see if our mysterious guest has any surprises of his own, Vali said, his voice distorted by the armor but still carrying clear challenge. He moved with inhuman speed, crossing the room in a blur that would have been invisible to normal human perception. But Ichigo's reflexes, honed by years of fighting beings that could move faster than sound, were up to the task. He sidestepped the attack, his own movement carrying the fluid precision of someone who had fought for his life countless times. Fast, Vali acknowledged, wheeling around for another pass. But let's see how you handle this. The armored devil's wing appendages glowed, and suddenly Ichigo felt something he hadn't experienced since his fight with Yahwach, his spiritual pressure being actively drained away. Not absorbed like the creature that had brought him to this world, but somehow divided, reduced, weakened. Interesting trick, Ichigo said, allowing Zangetsu to begin materializing in his hand. The massive sword flickered in and out of existence as his suppressed spiritual pressure fought against Vali's power. But I've dealt with power-stealing abilities before. Have you now? Vali's amusement was audible even through the armor's distortion. Then perhaps you can tell me why your power feels so familiar, yet completely alien at the same time. The question struck Ichigo like a physical blow. If his spiritual pressure felt familiar to this devil, it suggested connections between his world and this one that he hadn't considered. But before he could pursue that line of thought, Vali attacked again, this time with more serious intent. The clash between Zangetsu and the armored devil's clawed gauntlets sent shockwaves through the club room, shattering windows and sending papers flying in all directions. Ichigo found himself impressed despite the circumstances. Vali's speed and strength were genuinely formidable, easily on par with some of the espada he'd fought. But the devil was making a crucial mistake. He was fighting like someone who was used to having overwhelming power advantage over his opponents, relying on raw force and speed rather than technique and strategy. Ichigo, on the other hand, had learned to fight gods while operating under severe disadvantages. The next exchange proved decisive. Vali came in fast and hard, his draconic claws aimed at Ichigo's heart. Instead of blocking or dodging, Ichigo did something unexpected. He stepped forward inside the devil's guard and brought Zangetsu's hilt up in a precisely aimed strike that found the weak point where Vali's helmet connected to his chest plate. The armored devil staggered backward, his sacred gear flickering as his concentration was disrupted. Before he could recover, he found Zangetsu's blade resting against his throat. "Yield," Ichigo said quietly. For a moment, the room was utterly silent except for the sound of papers still settling to the floor. Then Vali began to laugh, the sound carrying genuine admiration. "Remarkable," he said, dismissing his sacred gear and returning to his normal human appearance. "It's been years since anyone has managed to defeat me in single combat." "I didn't defeat you," Ichigo corrected, stepping back and allowing his Zanpakuto to fade. "I just proved a point." "Which was?" Rias asked, her voice carrying new respect. "That I'm not looking for a fight with any of you," Ichigo replied simply. "I'm not here to challenge your territory or threaten your operations. I'm just trying to figure out where I am and how to get home." "Home?" Akeno leaned forward with interest. "And where might that be?" Ichigo hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth. "Somewhere that doesn't exist anymore. At least, not in any way I can reach from here." The statement sparked a new round of interested glances among the devils. Rias leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as she considered his words. "Dimensional displacement," she said finally. "That would explain why your spiritual signature is so unusual. You're not native to our reality." Something like that, Ichigo confirmed. Fascinating. Rias stood and moved to one of the bookshelves, selecting a thick tome bound in what looked like genuine leather. Dimensional travel is theoretically possible, but extremely dangerous. The few recorded cases usually resulted in the traveler being torn apart by the dimensional barriers. Maybe I got lucky, Ichigo said dryly. Or maybe you're tougher than most, Vali interjected, his golden eyes still studying Ichigo with obvious interest. That technique you used, it wasn't devil magic, or angel powers, or any sacred gear I recognize. What was it? Ichigo found himself at a crossroads. These devils had been surprisingly forthcoming about their own nature and abilities. Maintaining his secrets might be counterproductive if he hoped to learn anything useful from them. Where I come from, it's called Zanpakuto, he said finally. A soul cutter. It's the weapon of beings called soul reapers. Soul reapers. Kiba's eyes widened with obvious recognition. As in, beings who guide souls to the afterlife. Among other things, Ichigo confirmed, surprised by the knight's knowledge. Incredible, Rias breathed. We have legends of such beings, but they date back thousands of years. Most scholars believe they were simply myths created to explain early human concepts of death and judgment. Not myths, Ichigo said quietly. Or at least not where I come from. This changes everything, Akeno said, her voice filled with excitement. Do you realize what this means? If soul reapers actually exist in parallel dimensions, it could revolutionize our understanding of the afterlife mechanics. It could also cause a massive political upheaval, Vali pointed out pragmatically. The current balance of power between the three factions is based on the assumption that we control the afterlife experience for human souls, if there are other entities with legitimate claims to that authority. The three factions? Ichigo asked. Devils, angels, and fallen angels, Rias explained. We've been in a state of Cold War for centuries, ever since the Great War ended in mutual near extinction. The current peace is maintained through a careful balance of power and territory. And my presence threatens that balance? Potentially, she admitted. An unknown factor with the power to defeat one of the Longinus wielders could tip the scales significantly, especially if you represent a previously unknown faction. Ichigo absorbed this information, his strategic mind already working on the implications. If this world's supernatural politics were as delicate as Rias suggested, then his mere existence here could destabilize everything, potentially leading to a war that would put innocent people at risk. What if I agreed to stay neutral? He offered. No involvement in factional politics, no territorial claims, just a guy trying to keep a low profile while he figures out how to get home. That might have been possible before tonight, Rias said with obvious regret. But your battle with Rainier will have been reported to her superiors. By now, every major player in the supernatural world knows about you. Great, Ichigo muttered. So what you're telling me is that I've painted a target on my back just by defending myself. I'm afraid so, Rias confirmed. The good news is that we'd like to offer you our protection. The offer hung in the air between them, laden with implications that Ichigo was all too familiar with. In his experience, offers of protection from supernatural entities usually came with strings attached, strings that had a tendency to turn into chains. What's the catch? He asked bluntly. No catch, Rias said, though her smile suggested otherwise. Consider it professional courtesy between one protector of humanity and another. We help you maintain your low profile, and in exchange, you help us deal with supernatural threats that might be beyond our current capabilities. Like what? Like whatever sent you here in the first place, she replied. Dimensional rifts don't open by accident, and the kind of power required to punch a hole between realities suggests a threat that could affect our world as well. Ichigo considered the offer carefully. On one hand, having local allies who understood the supernatural landscape could be invaluable. On the other hand, getting involved with one faction's politics would inevitably mean making enemies of their rivals. But then he thought about Issei, running terrified through the park, while a fallen angel hunted him for reasons the boy didn't even understand. He thought about the ordinary humans of Kuo Town, going about their daily lives completely unaware of the supernatural predators that surrounded them. Temporary alliance, he said finally. I help you with genuine threats to innocent people, and you help me stay under the radar while I figure out my situation. But I'm not joining your peerage or whatever the equivalent would be. Fair enough, Rias agreed, extending her hand. Welcome to Kuo Town, Ichigo Kurosaki. As he shook her hand, Ichigo couldn't help but notice the way her spiritual pressure responded to his touch, a subtle resonance that suggested their powers might be more compatible than either of them had expected. It was an interesting development, but not one he was prepared to explore further just yet. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now we get you properly integrated into the local social structure," Akeno said with obvious enthusiasm. "Starting with enrolling you at Kuo Academy. Can't have our mysterious ally standing out as the only age-appropriate supernatural entity not attending classes. I take it that's not negotiable, not if you want to maintain a low profile," Rias confirmed. "Don't worry, we'll handle the paperwork and documentation, one of the advantages of having devil magic at our disposal." Ichigo nodded reluctantly. He'd been hoping to avoid the complications of high school social dynamics, but if it was necessary for his cover, he could endure it. Besides, it would give him opportunities to observe the local supernatural community without seeming overtly suspicious. "There is one more thing," Koneko said quietly, speaking up for the first time since her initial assessment of Ichigo's scent. "The boy who was with you earlier, Issei Hyodo, he saw the battle. He ran before things got serious," Ichigo pointed out. "But he saw enough," Rias said, her expression growing troubled. "Issei has been on our watch list for some time. He has the potential to develop supernatural abilities, but he's also exactly the type of person that fallen angels love to target." "Target for what?" "Sacred gear extraction," Vali explained grimly. "It's a process that kills the host, but allows the sacred gear to be transplanted into a more suitable bearer. Rainier's interest in this area probably wasn't coincidental." Ichigo felt a cold anger settle in his chest. The idea of murdering innocent people to steal their power was one that struck uncomfortably close to home, reminding him of some of the Quincy experimentation he'd witnessed during the war with Yahwach. "We can't let that happen," he said flatly. "No, we can't," Rias agreed, "which means we'll need to bring Issei under our protection as well. The question is whether we can do it before the fallen angels make their move." "How long do we have?" "Hard to say," Akeno replied. Rainier was clearly scouting the area tonight, but she retreated rather than pressing her attack. That suggests she was gathering intelligence rather than executing an immediate plan. "She'll be back," Ichigo said with certainty. "Probably with backup." "Most likely," Rias confirmed, "which means we need to move quickly. Ichigo, I know we just met, but would you be willing to help us protect Issei? Your combat abilities could make the difference between success and failure." Ichigo didn't even hesitate. "Of course." "Excellent," Rias smiled, and for the first time that evening, it looked completely genuine. "In that case, welcome to the Occult Research Club, Ichigo Kurosaki. I have a feeling your stay in our world is going to be very interesting indeed." As he looked around the room at faces that had gone from suspicious to welcoming, Ichigo reflected on how drastically his situation had changed in just a few hours. This morning, if it had even been this morning, given the dimensional displacement, he'd been a simple high school student trying to live a normal life. Now, he was apparently an interdimensional refugee allied with a group of devils against an undefined but growing supernatural threat. It should have been overwhelming, but instead, he found himself almost excited by the prospect. After months of peacetime boredom following the end of the war with Yahwach, it felt good to have a clear purpose again. Protecting innocent people from supernatural predators was something he understood, something he was good at. Even if the rules were different here, the core mission remained the same. "So," he said, settling into the ornate chair he'd refused earlier, "tell me everything I need to know about sacred gears." Outside the old school building, the night was dark and quiet, giving no hint of the alliance that had just been forged within its walls. But in the shadows between buildings, golden eyes watched and waited, already planning the next move in a game that was about to become much more complicated. The real test of Ichigo's new alliance was about to begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across Kuo Academy's courtyard as Ichigo made his way through the gates for his first official day as a student. The devil magic that had created his enrollment documents was impressively thorough, complete academic records, medical history, even a backstory about transferring from a private school in Tokyo due to his family's work situation. What the magic couldn't account for was the way other students instinctively gave him space as he walked through the hallways. His spiritual pressure, even suppressed as it was, apparently still carried enough weight to trigger subconscious responses in ordinary humans. The effect was subtle but noticeable. Conversations quieted when he passed. Groups unconsciously parted to let him through, and more than one student found excuses to avoid making direct eye contact. "Kurosaki-kun," a familiar voice called out, and Ichigo turned to see Issei Hyodo approaching with obvious relief. "I was hoping I'd see you today. Are you really transferring here?" Looks that way, Ichigo replied, noting how much more relaxed the boy seemed compared to their encounter in the park. Either Issei had incredible resilience, or his mind was actively suppressing memories of the supernatural battle he'd witnessed. How are you feeling after last night? Fine, mostly, Issei said, though there was a troubled look in his eyes. I keep having these weird dreams, though, like I was there for something important, but I can't quite remember what. Memory suppression, then. It was probably for the best. Ordinary humans weren't supposed to retain clear recollections of supernatural encounters. The fact that Issei was even having dreams suggested he had more potential than most. Dreams can be weird that way, Ichigo said diplomatically. Listen, if you ever feel like something strange is happening around you, don't try to handle it alone. Find help, okay? Before Issei could respond, a new presence registered on Ichigo's supernatural senses. Powerful, controlled, and definitely not human. He turned toward the source and found himself looking at a girl with long blonde hair and bright green eyes, dressed in the standard Kuo Academy uniform, but carrying herself with the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to authority. Irina Shidu, she said, extending her hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm new here too, transfer student from Vatican City. The mention of Vatican City immediately put Ichigo on alert. In his experience, people who traveled from the seat of the Catholic Church usually had very specific supernatural agendas. Her spiritual pressure carried a quality he was beginning to recognize: holy energy, similar to what he'd sensed from some of the Quincy, but with a distinctly different resonance. Ichigo Kurosaki, he replied, accepting the handshake. The moment their skin made contact, he felt her spiritual energy probe at his defenses, a subtle test that most people would never notice. Her eyes widened slightly at what she found, confirming his suspicions. Whatever Irina Shidu was, she definitely wasn't just another transfer student. How interesting, she murmured, too quietly for Issei to hear. You're not quite what you appear to be, are you? I could say the same about you, Ichigo replied equally quietly. Perhaps we should have a private conversation sometime, Irina suggested, her smile becoming more genuine. I have a feeling we might have some common interests. I'll think about it, Ichigo said noncommittally. The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of another figure, this one immediately recognizable from Ichigo's crash course in local supernatural politics the night before. Yudo Kiba approached with his usual elegant grace, though Ichigo noticed the knight's hand was positioned near what was probably a concealed weapon. Kurosaki-san, Kiba said with polite formality. Gremory-senpai asked me to show you to your classes. How thoughtful, Irina commented, her eyes moving between the two boys with obvious interest. Well, I should let you get settled in. We'll talk soon, Kurosaki-kun. As she walked away, Ichigo noticed that her movement carried the same fluid precision he associated with trained combatants. Whatever her role in the Vatican's supernatural operations, she wasn't just a scholar or administrator. Friend of yours? Kiba asked mildly. Just met, Ichigo replied. But I get the feeling she's going to be interesting to know. Indeed. Kiba's tone suggested he shared Ichigo's suspicions about their new classmate. We should discuss this with the others later. For now, though, we need to maintain normal appearances. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully, with Ichigo navigating the familiar routine of high school classes while his mind processed the implications of Irina's arrival. By lunchtime, he was ready for some answers, and the opportunity presented itself when Kiba led him to the old school building for what was ostensibly a tour of the facilities. The Occult Research Club room looked significantly different in daylight, less mysterious, more like an actual student club meeting space. Rias sat behind her desk reviewing what appeared to be supernatural intelligence reports, while Akeno prepared tea with the kind of elaborate ceremony that suggested it was more ritual than refreshment. Ah, Ichigo, Rias looked up with a welcoming smile. How was your first morning as a Kuo Academy student? Educational, Ichigo replied, accepting a cup of tea from Akeno. I met another transfer student, Irina Shidu, supposedly from Vatican City. The atmosphere in the room immediately grew tense. Koneko, who had been quietly reading in a corner chair, looked up with obvious alarm. Volley, who had apparently become a regular fixture despite not actually attending classes, straightened with predatory interest. Vatican City, Rias repeated slowly. That's concerning. Church operatives don't usually announce their affiliations so openly. Unless they want to be noticed, Akeno added thoughtfully, or unless the situation has become serious enough that subtlety is no longer a priority. What kind of situation? Ichigo asked. The kind that involves stolen holy relics and rogue priests, a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a girl with short blue-green hair and intense brown eyes, dressed in the same modified version of the school uniform that seemed to mark supernatural entities trying to blend in. Zenobia Quarta, she continued, stepping into the room with the confident stride of someone used to charging into dangerous situations. And before anyone asks, yes, I'm here on church business. The tension in the room ratcheted up another level. Ichigo noticed Kiba's hand move toward his concealed weapon, while Vali's spiritual pressure began to spike with obvious hostility. Only Rias seemed to maintain her composure, though her eyes had grown noticeably cooler. How direct, she said evenly. I don't suppose you'd care to elaborate on what kind of church business brings two operatives to our quiet little town. Excalibur, Zenobia replied bluntly. 3 fragments were stolen from church custody 2 weeks ago. Intelligence reports suggest they're being held somewhere in this area. Excalibur, Ichigo repeated, recognizing the name from Earth's legends, but suspecting the reality was probably more complicated. Not the Excalibur, Akeno explained. The original was destroyed during the Great War. What remains are 7 fragments, each reforged into individual holy swords with different properties. And 3 of them are missing, Zenobia continued, along with the priest who was supposed to be guarding them. Father Fried Selzen has gone completely rogue, and we have reason to believe he's working with fallen angels. The mention of fallen angels immediately caught Ichigo's attention. Would one of those fallen angels happen to be named Rainier? Zenovia's eyes sharpened. You know her. We met last night, Ichigo said dryly. She seemed very interested in something called sacred gears. That would fit the pattern, Zenobia admitted grudgingly. The stolen Excalibur fragments are being used to extract and transfer sacred gears from unwilling hosts. The process is usually fatal. Usually, Vali asked with obvious interest. There have been a few survivors, but they're left permanently damaged, unable to use their sacred gears, often suffering from severe spiritual scarring. Ichigo felt that familiar cold anger settling in his chest. The idea of torturing innocent people to steal their power was bad enough, but doing it with weapons that were supposed to represent justice and protection made it even worse. What do you need from us? He asked directly. Ichigo, Rias began, but he cut her off with a look. No, he said firmly. This isn't about politics or territorial disputes. This is about stopping people who are torturing innocents. I'm not going to stand by while that happens. Zenobia studied him with obvious surprise. You're willing to help church operatives. Most devils consider us natural enemies. I'm not a devil, Ichigo replied. And even if I were, some things are more important than old grudges. Interesting philosophy, Zenobia said, her expression softening slightly. Very well, we've traced the stolen fragments to an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. Irina is conducting surveillance while I attempted to negotiate for local support. Attempted? Rias asked with raised eyebrows. Your supernatural community is protective of its territory, Zenobia said diplomatically. Several faction representatives made it clear that church interference would not be welcome. Because they're idiots, Vali interjected bluntly. This isn't about territory. If rogue elements start using holy weapons for mass sacred gear extraction, it could destabilize the entire supernatural balance. My thoughts exactly, Zenobia agreed. Which is why I'm hoping cooler heads will prevail. Rias was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing political considerations against practical necessities. Finally, she sighed and nodded. Very well. The Gremory family will provide assistance, but this is a joint operation. We all go in together and we all share intelligence. Agreed, Zenobia said immediately. When do we move? Ichigo asked. Tonight, Zenobia replied. Our intelligence suggests they're planning something significant for tomorrow night, possibly a mass extraction event. If we're going to stop them, it has to be soon. As the group began discussing tactical details, Ichigo found himself thinking about Issei and the casual way Rainier had targeted him. How many other innocent people were walking around Kuo town completely unaware that they were being hunted by supernatural predators? There's something else, he said, interrupting the tactical discussion. Rainier specifically mentioned Issei Hyodo last night. If they're planning mass extractions, he's probably on their list. Almost certainly, Rias confirmed grimly. Issei has one of the strongest sacred gear potentials we've detected in years. He'd be a prime target. Then we need to warn him, Ichigo said. With what explanation? Akeno pointed out. He's a normal human with no knowledge of the supernatural world. We can't just tell him he's being hunted by fallen angels. We could bring him under our protection, Kiba suggested. Offer him a place in the peerage. That would mean turning him into a devil, Rias said reluctantly. It's not a decision to make lightly. Better a live devil than a dead human, Ichigo pointed out bluntly. Perhaps, Zenovia interjected, we could offer an alternative. The church has protection programs for sacred gear users. We could arrange… No. Ichigo's voice carried absolute finality. I'm not handing over a 17-year-old kid to any organization, no matter how good their intentions are. If Issei needs protection, we provide it ourselves. The room fell silent as everyone processed his declaration. Finally, Rias spoke up with obvious amusement. Mai, you're quite protective for someone who claims to want to stay neutral. Some things transcend neutrality, Ichigo replied. Protecting innocent people from predators is one of them. In that case, Zenovia said, her respect for him clearly growing, perhaps you'd be interested to know that our intelligence suggests Freed isn't working alone. The warehouse is being used as a base by at least a dozen rogue operatives, including several fallen angels. How several? Vali asked, his own interest clearly piqued. At least 4, possibly more. And that's not counting whatever sacred gear users they might have already recruited. Ichigo absorbed this information, his tactical mind already working on the implications. A dozen hostile operatives, multiple stolen holy weapons, at least 4 fallen angels, and an unknown number of coerced sacred gear users. It was going to be a challenging fight, especially with his powers still operating at reduced capacity. But he'd faced worse odds before. All right, he said, standing up and moving to the window that overlooked the main campus. Here's what we're going to do. As he began outlining his plan, Ichigo couldn't help but notice the way the others automatically deferred to his tactical expertise. Even Rias, who was clearly used to being in command, listened with obvious respect as he laid out contingencies and fallback positions. It was a reminder that leadership wasn't about official titles or political authority. It was about being willing to make the hard decisions when lives were on the line. And tonight, a lot of lives were going to be on the line. Outside the window, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, as if the weather itself was responding to the supernatural tensions building in Kuo town. By tomorrow morning, the balance of power in the local supernatural community was going to be very different. The question was whether they'd all still be alive to see it. 3 weeks had passed since the warehouse raid that had cemented Ichigo's place in Kuo town's supernatural community. The operation had been a complete success. The stolen Excalibur fragments recovered, the rogue operatives captured, and most importantly, no innocent sacred gear users had been harmed. But the victory had come with consequences that Ichigo was still learning to navigate. Word of his abilities had spread throughout the supernatural networks, drawing attention from far more powerful entities than the local devils and fallen angels he'd been dealing with. The most immediate result was sitting across from him in the occult research club room, her crimson hair catching the afternoon sunlight as she stared at an ornate letter with obvious distress. Arranged marriage, Rias said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of anger and resignation. To Riser Phoenix, 3rd son of the Phoenix family, the ceremony is scheduled for next month. Ichigo looked up from the homework he'd been pretending to work on. Can't you just refuse? It's not that simple, Akeno explained from her position by the tea service. Devil nobility politics are complicated. The Gremory and Phoenix families have been allies for centuries, and this marriage would solidify important political bonds. Plus, Kiba added with obvious bitterness, the Phoenix family has been very vocal about the need to preserve pure bloodlines in the wake of recent disruptions to the supernatural balance. The implication was clear enough. Ichigo's presence and the subsequent upheavals in local politics had made the old families nervous, and they were consolidating power through traditional means. What's this riser like? Ichigo asked, though he suspected he already knew from the way everyone in the room had grown tense at the mention of the name. Arrogant, self-centered, and completely convinced that women exist solely for his entertainment, Rias replied with undisguised disgust. He already has a peerage of 15 female devils, all of whom he treats as personal property. Charming, Ichigo said dryly, and there's no way out of this. Only one, Rias admitted reluctantly. A raiding game. If I can defeat Riser in formal combat, the engagement would be nullified. Then challenge him. It's not that easy, Vali interjected from his usual position by the window. Even though he'd never officially joined the club, he'd become a regular presence, drawn by what he called the interesting developments surrounding Ichigo's activities. Riser Phoenix is immortal. He literally cannot be killed or permanently injured. Plus, his peerage includes some extremely powerful devils with complementary abilities. How immortal are we talking? Ichigo asked, his strategic mind already working on the problem. Complete regeneration from any injury, immunity to most forms of damage, essentially unlimited stamina, Akeno listed with obvious frustration. The Phoenix family supernatural trait is considered one of the most powerful in the devil nobility. And his peerage? 15 devils, all female, all chosen specifically to complement his fighting style and cover his few weaknesses, Rias replied. They've been training together for decades. My peerage, talented as they are, simply doesn't have the experience or coordination to match that level of preparation. Ichigo was quiet for a moment, processing the tactical situation. An immortal opponent with a highly coordinated team against a smaller, less experienced group. In conventional terms, it was an impossible fight. But Ichigo had never been particularly concerned with conventional limitations. What if you had help? He asked carefully. Rating games are conducted between peerages, Kiba explained. Outside assistance isn't allowed under traditional rules. What about non-traditional rules? Ichigo, Rias said with obvious warning in her voice. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that sometimes the traditional rules need to be bent a little, he replied. Tell me more about how these rating games work. Over the next hour, Ichigo received a comprehensive education in devil combat sports. Rating games were formal duels between devil nobles, conducted in pocket dimensions designed to simulate various battlefield conditions. Each side could field up to 15 combatants, with different peace ranks determining their allowed capabilities and restrictions. The more he learned, the more Ichigo became convinced that the system was designed to favor established powers over innovation. Traditional tactics, predictable strategies, overwhelming force rather than creative problem-solving. It was exactly the kind of hidebound thinking that he'd spent years fighting against. When is this rating game supposed to take place? He asked. 5 days from now, Rias replied. Barely enough time to develop new strategies, even if we had any idea what they might be. 5 days, Ichigo mused. That's not much time, but it might be enough. Enough for what? Koneko asked, speaking up from her corner chair where she'd been quietly observing the conversation. Training, Ichigo said simply. All of you are individually powerful, but you're not fighting as a coordinated unit. Against Riser's experienced team, that's going to get you killed. And you think you can fix that in 5 days? Vali asked with obvious skepticism. I've seen it done in less time, Ichigo replied, memories of his crash course in Soul Reaper techniques flickering through his mind. But it's going to require everyone to trust me completely and follow my instructions without question. Even if that means doing things that seem impossible, Rias asked. Especially then, Ichigo confirmed. Traditional devil combat techniques aren't going to work against an immortal opponent. We need to think outside the normal parameters. Akeno leaned forward with obvious interest. What did you have in mind? First, we need to understand that this isn't really about defeating Riser, Ichigo said, standing up and moving to the room's whiteboard. He's immortal, so direct combat approaches are going to fail. This is about neutralizing his advantages and exploiting his weaknesses. He doesn't have any weaknesses, Kiba pointed out. Everyone has weaknesses, Ichigo replied, beginning to sketch tactical diagrams. Riser's biggest weakness is his arrogance. He's so convinced of his own superiority that he doesn't adapt well when faced with unexpected tactics. Unexpected how? Rias asked. By fighting like Soul Reapers instead of devils. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of that statement. Finally, Vali spoke up with obvious fascination. You want to teach them your techniques. Some of them, Ichigo confirmed. The ones that don't require specifically Soul Reaper physiology, movement techniques, sensory enhancement, tactical coordination methods that your opponents won't be prepared for. Is that even possible? Akeno wondered. We're about to find out, Ichigo replied. But first, I need to see exactly what each of you can do at your current maximum capacity. No holding back, no worrying about property damage. I need to understand your capabilities before I can help you expand them. What followed was the most intensive combat assessment Ichigo had ever conducted. Each member of Rias' peerage demonstrated their abilities in turn, while he analyzed their techniques with the critical eye of someone who'd learned to fight from masters like Urahara and Yoruichi. Kiba's sword techniques were impressive but limited by traditional European fencing styles. His sacred gear allowed him to create weapons with various elemental properties, but he wasn't using the full tactical potential of that ability. Akaino's lightning-based attacks were devastatingly powerful but predictable in their application. She had the raw power to match most ultimate-class devils, but her combat experience was primarily against weaker opponents who couldn't force her to develop more sophisticated techniques. Koneko's physical abilities were extraordinary, with strength and speed that rivaled some of the Arrancar Ichigo had fought. But she was holding back, limiting herself to techniques that felt safe rather than exploring the full potential of her supernatural nature. And Rias herself was perhaps the most frustrating case. Her raw power was enormous, easily on par with a captain-level Soul Reaper, but she'd been trained in the cautious, defensive style favored by devil nobility. She fought like someone who expected to outlast her opponents rather than overwhelm them. "All right," Ichigo said once the assessments were complete. "Here's what we're going to do." Over the next 4 days, Ichigo put Rias' peerage through a training regimen that would have challenged veteran Soul Reapers. He taught Kiba advanced swordsmanship techniques that turned weapon creation into a fluid combat dance. He showed Akaino how to use her lightning powers for more than just direct attacks, incorporating battlefield control and sensory enhancement. He helped Koneko break through the psychological barriers that were limiting her physical potential. And for Rias, he designed a completely new fighting style based on rapid mobility and overwhelming offense rather than the defensive endurance tactics she'd been taught. The training was brutal, pushing each of them beyond what they'd thought possible. But the results were immediately apparent. By the 3rd day, they were moving and fighting as a coordinated unit in ways that none of them had imagined possible. "This is incredible," Rias said during a brief rest break, her crimson hair damp with perspiration but her eyes bright with excitement. "I can feel the difference in how we're working together." "It's not just the techniques," Kiba observed, flexing his fingers as he dismissed another created sword. "It's the mindset. We're not fighting like devils anymore." "No," Ichigo agreed. "You're fighting like a team that trusts each other completely. That's going to be your biggest advantage against Riser's group." "Will it be enough?" Akaino asked quietly. "Against a conventional opponent, absolutely," Ichigo replied. "Against Riser, we'll find out tomorrow." The day of the raiding game dawned clear and cold, with an unseasonable chill that seemed to permeate the very air around Kuo Academy. Ichigo arrived at the old school building to find the entire peerage already assembled, their expressions ranging from nervous excitement to grim determination. "Ready for this?" he asked Rias. "As ready as we're ever going to be," she replied, though he could sense the tension in her voice. "The game begins at sunset. Are you sure you can't participate directly?" "Raiding game rules are pretty specific," Ichigo said with apparent regret. "But I'll be watching from the observation area. If anything goes seriously wrong, rules or no rules, I'm coming in." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Vali said, appearing beside them with his usual dramatic flair. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious to see how your training holds up against Phoenix immortality." "It'll hold up," Ichigo said with quiet confidence. "Trust the techniques, trust each other, and remember you're not trying to kill him. You're trying to prove he can't kill you either." As the sun began to set, the peerage made their final preparations before being transported to the raiding game dimension. Ichigo watched them go with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing that he'd done everything he could to prepare them for what was coming. The question now was whether it would be enough to overcome centuries of supernatural politics and the raw power of Phoenix immortality. In a few hours, they'd all have their answer. The raiding game dimension materialized around Rias' peerage like a vast replica of Kuo Academy, complete with multiple buildings, courtyards, and tactical positions. But Ichigo could see through the observation screens that Riser's team was already moving with practiced efficiency, spreading out to secure key positions with the coordination of a military unit. 15 against 5, Vali observed from beside him in the viewing area. "Not exactly favorable odds." "Numbers aren't everything," Ichigo replied, though he had to admit the tactical situation looked challenging. "They've got quality on their side now." On the screens, he watched Rias' team implement the strategies they'd practiced. Instead of trying to hold defensive positions like traditional devil nobility, they were moving aggressively, using the mobility techniques he'd taught them to strike at isolated members of Riser's peerage. The first engagement proved the effectiveness of their new approach. Kiba appeared behind one of Riser's knights in a burst of speed that clearly caught the Phoenix Peerage off guard, his created blade moving with precision that ended the fight in seconds. "Impressive," came a new voice from behind them. Ichigo turned to see a man with golden hair and an aura of barely contained power that marked him as one of the devil nobility. "Your training methods seem to have been quite effective." "Surzech Lucifer," Vali said with obvious respect, standing and offering a formal bow. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "My sister's raiding game against an immortal opponent," Surzech replied with amusement. "I wouldn't miss it. Besides, I wanted to meet the mysterious individual who's been causing such interesting disruptions in our peaceful little town." Ichigo found himself being studied by eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. There was power in this devil that dwarfed anything he'd encountered since arriving in this dimension, not just raw strength, but the kind of refined control that came from centuries of experience. "Ichigo Kurosaki," he said, offering a respectful nod, "and you're Rias' brother." "Among other things," Surzech confirmed. "I understand you've been helping prepare her for this battle. Unconventional techniques, I'm told. Sometimes unconventional problems require unconventional solutions," Ichigo replied diplomatically. On the screens, the battle was intensifying. Akaino had engaged two of Riser's pieces simultaneously, her lightning attacks enhanced with the precision techniques Ichigo had taught her. Instead of raw destructive blasts, she was using targeted strikes that disrupted her opponent's coordination and forced them into disadvantageous positions. "Fascinating," Surzech murmured, his attention fixed on the tactical displays. "She's fighting like, well, not like any devil I've ever seen." "Like a soul reaper," Vali said quietly, earning a sharp look from the Devil King. "Indeed," Surzech's interest clearly sharpened. "And where might someone learn such techniques?" Before either of them could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the observation area. On the main screen, Riser Phoenix himself had finally entered the battle, his presence immediately shifting the tactical balance. His immortal flames began consuming the battlefield, forcing Rias' team into increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers. "This is where it gets interesting," Ichigo murmured, leaning forward to watch more closely. Riser's strategy was brutally simple: use his immortality to absorb any attacks while his flames gradually wore down his opponents. Against conventional devil tactics, it was essentially unbeatable. But Rias' team was no longer fighting conventionally. Instead of engaging Riser directly, they began implementing the advanced coordination techniques Ichigo had drilled into them. Kiba created a series of elemental weapons that formed a tactical perimeter, while Akaino used precision lightning strikes to control Riser's movement options. Koneko moved in close for physical attacks that weren't meant to cause damage, but to disrupt his positioning, and Rias herself began charging what was clearly a devastating finishing technique. "They're not trying to hurt him," Surzech realized with obvious surprise. "They're trying to contain him." "Exactly," Ichigo confirmed. "You can't beat immortality through direct combat, but you can neutralize it through superior tactics and coordination." The climax came when Rias unleashed her charged attack, not the traditional power of destruction that Riser would have expected, but something new. Her crimson energy, refined and focused through the techniques Ichigo had taught her, struck with surgical precision at specific points around Riser's position. The Phoenix Heir found himself trapped in what was essentially a power null field, his immortal flames dampened by precise energy interference. For the first time in his life, Riser Phoenix was vulnerable. "Impossible," breathed one of the other observers. "Checkmate," Ichigo said quietly. The raiding game ended with Riser's formal surrender, not because he was defeated, but because he recognized that he could be defeated if the battle continued. The political implications were staggering, and Ichigo could already see the wheels turning in Surzech's mind. "Remarkable," the Devil King said as the screens went dark. "Your sister has achieved something I wouldn't have thought possible." "She had good training," Vali replied with obvious respect. "Indeed." Surzech turned to Ichigo with an expression that mixed admiration with calculation. "I think we need to have a much longer conversation, Kurosaki-san, about your techniques, your origins, and your intentions regarding our world." "Looking forward to it," Ichigo replied, though he suspected the conversation would be more interrogation than friendly chat. As the observation area began to empty, he reflected on what had just happened. Rias' victory over Riser would send ripples throughout the supernatural community, challenging long-held assumptions about power and politics. The techniques he taught them would be analyzed, copied, and eventually distributed throughout the devil nobility. His presence in this world was no longer a secret that could be maintained through simple low profiles and careful politics. He just demonstrated capabilities that would make him a target for recruitment, alliance, or elimination by every major faction. But looking at the pride and relief on Ria's face as she returned from the raiding game dimension, Ichigo found he didn't regret his decision. Some things were more important than maintaining a quiet existence. Protecting friends was definitely one of them. The real question was what would happen when the other supernatural factions learned about the techniques he'd taught and decided they wanted access to that knowledge themselves. Somehow, Ichigo suspected that was going to become a problem very soon. And that's where we're leaving part 1. Ichigo's already made quite an impression on the supernatural community in Kuo Town, hasn't he? From fighting Rainier to training Rias peerage for the raiding game against Riser, our displaced Soul Reaper is definitely not keeping a low profile. What did you think of how I handled the power scaling and the interactions between these two universes? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this crossover story, maybe consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more parts. It really helps me know if you want to see where this goes next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.